We are excited that we have Richard Haass, the author of The Bill of Obligations. Dr. Richard Haass is the president of Nonpartisan Council on Foreign Relations. He's an experienced diplomat and policymaker. He has served in the Pentagon, State Department, and White House under 4 presidents, both Democrat and Republican alike. He's a recipient of the Presidential Citizens Medal, the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award, and the Tipperary International Peace Award. He's a friend of the Council. Please welcome our Chief Program Officer, Ronan O'Malley, together with Richard Haass.
Well, thank you very much, Marianne. Thank all of you for coming. And for any of you who might be curious, the institute Marianne mentioned, it's our kind of global affairs and foreign policy institute. The backbone of one of our texts is Richard's second most recent book called The World, very modestly titled book, but an excellent resource. We're also going to use it for our high school classes over the summer. If you want a great insider's view, somebody who's in the room, not just an academic or an analyst, but someone who's inside the room with regards to American foreign policy in the last 30, 40 years and how the global world order came to be as it is now. Hopefully it's not getting challenged too much, but it is. That book is The World, which is excellent too. Today we're talking about his book that Marianne mentioned, The Bill of Obligations. Richard, for many of you know, has been for many years one of our most popular speakers, leading the most preeminent foreign policy think tank in the United States, and probably realistically speaking the world. And before that, incredible expertise initially under a Democratic senator, 4 presidents, both 3 Republican and 1 Democrat. And just for people to know,
2 of them from Texas.
2 of them Texas, yes. 1 of them from here. For anyone who might be wondering why this is the 12th or 13th book you've either written or edited, almost all that have been looking outside the United States. Why is it that you are so concerned about our current political moment, this current divisiveness, something we try to address in the council, bringing Democrats and Republicans together, that concerned you so much that you felt this was the most important book for you to write now?
First of all, it's great to be back. Thank you for your interest. I mean, how could you not be concerned? Seriously, how could you not be concerned? If you're not concerned, you're not paying attention. And the reason I wrote this book, and it's not something I ever thought I'd do, is when I'd meet with groups like yours, and people would say, what keeps you up at night? Is it China or Russia or Iran or climate change? I say, yeah, those are all big issues. They all, they're high on my list of concerns. But what really keeps me up at night is us. And if we're divided, if we can't pass the necessary legislation we need to make this a functioning society and economy, worse yet, if we're at war with ourselves, how in the world are we going to set an example anyone out there is going to want to follow? How are we going to have the unity, the resources to act in the world? How are we going to have the bandwidth? So the reason I got to this issue was almost through the back door, but I see this as a national security issue. And if you think about it, I'm going to talk about coins a little bit tonight. Well, this is a national security coin, and one side is the traditional stuff of foreign policy. And the other side of the coin is domestic. It is our cohesion, and it is our ability to act collectively in the world.
And there are 10 obligations in here. Maybe briefly, we won't cover them all. There's just not enough time. I will jump around a little bit out of order, but I thought I might start with civics. We're an educational organization. It might be a book you write down the line, which would be much needed as well. Could you talk about maybe the need for teaching civics in the United States? And maybe one of the things you highlight in the book that it's so important is, unlike a lot of other countries, we do not have one dominant religion, ethnic group, race, that the only thing we have to hold us together as a very powerful force is our ideology and our beliefs. But if we don't have those in common, then the future is pretty dire.
I will get to that. But first, I'm going to take a little detour. As was meant, before I get to that obligation, which is in some ways my favorite obligation, and I'm on a bit of a mission to get civics not just taught, but required as a condition of graduation in high schools and colleges and universities in this country. But we'll get to there. Thank you. Okay, I think we can finish. We're done. Before I get to that, let me sort of make the case for obligations, because it's not obvious. If I asked you to free associate with the word democracy, pretty quickly you'd come up with words like rights and freedom. If you go back to our history, obviously the Bill of Rights. Well, it turns out the Bill of Rights were essential in order to get the Constitution ratified. And if you recall your American history, the Constitution was not the original Constitution. It was the second Constitution. The first Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, which were incredibly weak. Each of the 13 original states remained sovereign. There was no real executive branch. And the country, after defeating the British in the war, was essentially losing the peace. We were falling apart. And the leaders, the so-called founders, convened in Philadelphia. And the ostensible purpose was to amend the Articles of Confederation to make them more effective, more of a blueprint for government. That was kind of the original bait and switch. Very, very quickly, they said, we can't even begin to amend these. They're so terrible. Let's just start over. And it just so happens that several of them had a draft constitution in their pockets. It's amazing how these things work out. But if you think about it, this was still just a few years after the Revolutionary War. So a lot of people who were the most fierce opponents of the British also became pretty fierce opponents of this proposed constitution, because they were worried it was too strong. And you literally had people like Patrick Henry, Mr. Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, saying things like, we just defeated one tyranny that was external. Why do we want to trade that for a tyranny that's internal? So several states, before they would ratify this proposed constitution, said we have to put some limits on it. And that became the Bill of Rights. And first 10 amendments of the Constitution, obviously. And what they really do is limit the reach of the federal government, this new federal government, and its ability to overrule the states. That was really in many ways, and to some extent also protected individuals. So protected states' rights and individual rights against the encroachment of this new federal government. Constitution was passed, and a lot of American history over the last nearly 2.5 centuries, and by the way, spoiler alert, in 3 years, we are going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And a lot of American history can be understood in some ways as the effort to narrow the gap or close the gap between the ideals articulated in the Declaration and the reality of what was going on in the country. And Abraham Lincoln, who was president at the greatest crisis in American history, literally talked about the unfinished work of America. And what he was alluding to was the unfinished work was making the rights real, to make the promises and the principles of the Declaration, to make them real. And that is a lot of our history, and I think we've made a lot of progress, including in recent years, in the lifetimes of everybody in this room. It's not finished. And obviously improving upon respect for rights remains a central dimension of American history. My argument is that even if we had a magic wand, and by midnight tonight, the unfinished work of America could be finished, and protection for our rights would finally eliminate any gap between our principles and our practices, American democracy would still be in serious trouble. And the reason is that rights inevitably collide. It was Stephen Breyer, who until recently was a justice on the Supreme Court, said the toughest cases that come before the court are not rights versus wrongs, they're rights versus rights. I mean, think about the news the last 2 weeks, last couple of days. One is over abortion and this pill. What are the rights of the mother to choose versus the rights of the unborn? How do we balance the two? Or the rights of an individual to acquire virtually any firearm he or she wants versus the rights of other individuals to public safety. Or during the pandemic, there were endless battles over the rights of individuals not to be vaccinated, not to wear a mask, versus the rights of others to public health and another form of public safety. Well, how do we navigate these inevitable collisions? And that's how I came on the idea of obligations. So I mentioned before a coin with two sides, the national security coin, one side foreign policy, one side domestic. Think of a citizenship coin. One side rights, the other side obligations. And the obligations are of two sorts in general. One is the obligations of every single individual in this room towards one another. What do we owe each other? We're all members of this society. We're all members of this community. And second of all, what do each of us owe this country of ours? Very much in the tradition of John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So what should we be doing for our country? So the reason I wrote this book was to launch something of a national conversation about our obligations and not just our rights. What do we owe one another? What do we owe the country? And that's how I got here.
And I'll just start with the first obligation. And
We're not going to start with civics anymore.
Sure. What I'm saying, but I think, you discussed it. It's important for us to know how the country was formed.
Yep.
Like you mentioned, the necessity of the Constitution after 10 years, basically, of floundering, unfortunately. But how important it is. That's why I'm so grateful the teachers are out here tonight who brought students. Thank you very much, and bring students all the time. Your first obligation, in some ways, kind of parallels to our mission at the council, is to hopefully help the greater Houston area become informed of what's happening in the world, hearing from a variety of different perspectives.
Yep.
Can you talk about the importance of that and really the challenges of that in the last 10, 15, 20 years when social media or polarization of what's on MSNBC and CNN or on Fox, that more and more people are going to their media sources for affirmation than information. They're going for confirmation of their perspective and their bias. Mm-hmm. How difficult is that? And maybe just because it's in the news, we just heard that the what seems like a large settlement yesterday with Fox News and Dominion, voting systems. Maybe would that chasten some of these extreme kind of conspiracy theories that get put out there? Or when you look at Rupert Murdoch, almost $800 million. He's made tens of billions of dollars with Fox in the last 30 years in the United States. Maybe it's not that much money, and to him, he doesn't have to testify in court under oath. Fox, opinion hosts in the evening who kind of challenge credibility with some of what they say, they don't have to testify under oath. Can you talk about the broader issue and maybe your perspective on this ruling?
Well, let me first go to basics. The idea of an informed citizenry being a prerequisite for a thriving democracy is as old as the country itself. Jefferson spoke a lot about how informed citizenry was central to democracy. Only if citizens were informed could they hold those with authority and power to account. It was essential. You also needed transparency, which is why he was such a passionate defender of a free press. So he thought you needed informed citizens. The way citizens would often get informed was not just in classrooms, but through the light that the press would shed on the functioning and workings of government. Ronald Reagan, 2 centuries later, in his farewell address, which is really one of the great speeches, talked not just about patriotism. And he said, I like patriotism, obviously. I'm glad to see this rise in genuine national feelings. But he said, it's not good enough. Indeed, it has to be informed patriotism. He put down an important adjective and a condition, because all sorts of things could be done in the name of patriotism that turn out to be anything but patriotic. And that's why being informed is so essential. But you're exactly right. Here we are at a time where if any of us has a question, our first instincts take out our device and go on Google. So you would think that this is the easiest moment in history to be informed. And it turns out in some ways it's the toughest, because there's so much out there. And information doesn't label itself saying, I'm a fact, I'm an opinion, I'm actually neither, I'm just misinformation. So the question is, how do you navigate this flood of, to use a technical word, stuff that is out there? And it turns out it's really difficult. What I believe we need to start doing is to teach how to just do that. It's interesting, New Jersey is the first state that has passed a requirement for its public schools to teach information literacy. And the whole idea is students will be taught not what to think, they'll be taught how to be a critical consumer of information. How do I recognize a fact for being a fact? How do I know? How do I test it? Someone asserts something. How do I know whether this is true? Where do I go? What are the rules? What are the best practices of dealing with this flood of information? So there's things that you can do. For example, you could ask yourself, when someone says it's a fact, what evidence are they bringing to bear? How many experts in the field are actually signing on to it? So for someone who might deny climate change as opposed to one who might say climate change is real, you have to look at who's marshaling most of the scientific evidence. It's pretty clear. Or another thing I would say is, if any of us got a diagnosis from a doctor and it was a serious one of a disease, we probably wouldn't stop there. We'd probably get a second opinion. Okay, why not get second opinions when it comes to American democracy? Somebody, as you watch on MSNBC, and you hear something, why not go listen to something else on CNN or Fox or vice versa, or different radio stations? Go to multiple newspapers, not just one. All newspapers have a degree of bias, no matter how well edited they are, even the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and so forth. Any newspaper inevitably has a degree of bias in what it covers or how it covers it. So get a second opinion there. Might take a little bit of time, but just like your health, I would think the health of our democracy is arguably worth it. So what we can do is teach people how to become more critical consumers. And the reason this is so essential, one of my favorite quotes in the book is the one from the former senator from New York, where I live, which is Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He was an advisor to Richard Nixon. He was a Harvard professor, one of the great thinkers of the late 20th century in America. And his line was, everyone's entitled to his or her own opinion, just not to their own set of facts. And facts become the foundation of debate. You know, we're going to have a big debate in a few months about the debt servicing, what to do about our debt. Now, the beginning of the conversation has got to be, we have $31 trillion in debt. We can argue about how we got there. We can argue about whether it matters. We can obviously argue about what to do about it. But we can only begin to have a serious policy conversation if we agree on the premise. So it all turns out to be, I think, essential for a democracy to function. In the case of Fox and all that, I didn't have a specific obligation, though. I'll have to figure out a way to work it into the paperback edition. But journalists have obligations. Journalists have special authority in our country, again, almost in Jefferson's tradition. We are looking to journalists to spend all their time to shed a light on government, to make sure there's not corruption, to look at the quality of decision-making, the quality of execution. We have got to have confidence that the journalists are straight shooters. If it turns out that journalists aren't journalists, but they're propagandists, we are in a whole lot of trouble. And quite honestly, that is what Fox, at least certain individuals on Fox, have begun. I'll say it here, I'll probably lose half the audience here. I'm disappointed that there was a settlement. I would have much preferred a trial. I wanted to see it out there. And I wanted that to be a civics lesson. I wanted people to understand what the responsibilities or obligations of journalists are and see how people defended the fact when they violated them. I'm worried that this might not be enough of a precedent for the reason you suggested, that you can write this off. And what I wanted was people to have to publicly defend purveying information that they knew to be false. If journalists were licensed, we would revoke a license for journalism for doing that. If lawyers have certain obligations to meet and they lose, they can get disbarred because they are known as officers of the court. Yes, you have an obligation as a lawyer, say, to the person you're defending, but you also have an obligation to the system and to tell the truth. And I believe the same, journalists should be held to an equal standard.
I suppose just to take a phrase from history, silent majority obviously has different connotations, 50 plus years ago with Nixon, But I think in the U.S. right now, maybe there's a silent majority of reasonable Democrats, reasonable Republicans, and a big number of independents who are just tired of both parties, who are tired of dysfunction, tired of a Congress, if it flips, Republican, Democrat, back and forth, they get nothing done, they won't work together, they won't pass any substantial bills. One of your other key obligations is being open and to compromise. Can you talk about the necessity for compromise, but also our primary system, especially with gerrymandering, and it comes from the left and the right, has been so divisive that in any given cycle, 80+% of congressional districts are not in play. Whoever wins the primary, 6 months later, they're going to win the election. So the general election doesn't matter, but it's the extremists from both sides who push hardline positions and hardline candidates who kind of send these, Marjorie Taylor Greenes or AOCs or whatever you like to Congress, and it's just dysfunctional. How do we I suppose, put a preference on compromise, but we're with a primary system where everybody's terrified of getting primaried?
I've got to mention one thing in the other answer, which is the other thing to be really wary of is social media. Think about the word social media. It's not called serious media. It's not called scientific media or factual media. It's social media. So go there for social reasons. Do not go to social media for facts or to be informed. There's no gatekeepers in social media. It tends to be communities or individuals posting, often anonymously, but it has a role to play, and I learn things from social media. I spend a few minutes on it every day, but it is not a substitute for or a serious path for getting informed. Much more likely to get misinformed. Look, what you say about the country is true. Our political system now incentivizes in many ways a kind of political purity, where compromise has become a dirty word, a four-letter word effectively. And it's everything, you're right. To close primaries where only people from a single party vote, districts that are drawn to emphasize one party or the other, the way we fund our politics. That any candidate now is effectively his or her own political movement. And they can get money from this or that PAC or super PAC. Parties can be bypassed, and often those with the strongest, shall we say, or purest or most extreme voices are rewarded. It's what, 50, 60 years, 70 years maybe, I don't know, since JFK wrote with Ted Sorensen his book Profiles in Courage. Well, half of the senators profiled as being politically courageous were people who compromised. Somewhere along the way, the word compromise became something of a sellout. It can be. And my argument is not always to compromise, but you've got to be open to it. And anytime you're faced with a situation where you've got competing views, you've got to ask yourself, I would say, am I better off with or without an available compromise? And in some cases, it may be better not. In many cases, I think you are better off with it. But politicians, though, will only act more responsibly if responsible, intelligent compromise is rewarded. If it's penalized out of self-interest, very few of them are going to put, to take my 10th obligation, they're going to put country before themselves or their party. So it's really up to us, citizens, to reward good behaviors and penalize bad ones. Look, in the most recent midterm elections in November, more than half the eligible voters in this country still didn't vote. So it's on us. People can talk about rewriting congressional districts and changing the rules and laws about how we fund politics. Ain't going to happen anytime soon. We are where we are for lots of good reasons. The easiest thing to change is citizens getting informed and politically getting active. You don't need new legislation to do that. You don't need the Supreme Court to you need people to spend a little bit of time and then to go out and vote, or organize, or contribute money, or whatever. So it's really on us. So when I hear from a lot of people, two things. One, it's hopeless. I go, not really. If you look at the last few elections, a tiny percentage of voters swung the outcome. In this most recent midterm elections, 4 or 5 congressional races in my state in New York, in districts that were traditionally Republican, Democratic districts, went Republican. That is why Kevin McCarthy is Speaker of the House. You may think that's a great outcome or a terrible outcome. That's not my point. My point is that small numbers of voters have enormous impact. Look at the last few presidential elections. A couple of thousand voters in a couple of states have decided the outcome in the electoral college. So voting really does make a difference. So affecting political change in this country is not a hopeless exercise, but the most direct path is not major structural reforms. It's extraordinarily difficult. That's why I don't have a whole lot of enthusiasm for a lot of these reformist groups. Not that their ideas are bad, they're simply not going to happen. So I think the simplest way to bring about political change is for citizens to bring it about directly through the ballot box.
Another important obligation you bring up, and hopefully we try to practice it here ourselves at the council, is the importance of civility, both within the citizenry of the United States, yes, and within our politicians. You have a great quote of JFK: "Civility is not a weakness," and Bush, you served under, civility is a choice of trust over cynicism. Or I would say any of you who came 2 months ago when we hosted former Vice President Pence, I think to me the embodiment of civility. You might agree or disagree with his policies, but he specifically will say, I'm not going to get in the mud, I'm going to get down in the name calling. Why is that so important to an effective and capable democracy?
For a couple of reasons. One is there's inevitably political differences. We don't agree. It's actually healthy we don't agree. Through the competition of ideas, through debating. And the rest is hopefully how we come to better political outcomes. But there's no chance of getting from here to there if it's not done in a civil way. When my kids were younger, much to their annoyance, I used to point out, particularly to one of them, that your arguments don't improve when you speak louder or faster or over the other person. That was not much appreciated. I thought it was a really good parenting point, but somehow it was lost. There's also a really practical thing here. It's not only are you not likely to persuade by being uncivil, but think about it. We're not a one-issue country. We're dealing with dozens of issues. If we damage or break a relationship on to today, which is what, Wednesday, because of how we go about an argument, what's going to happen tomorrow when another issue comes up and someone we might normally be able to work with wants no part of it because we've done so much damage to the relationship? So it turns out civility is not just the right thing to do in a values way. It's not just the right thing to do. That's the way we want to be treated, with respect and decency. It turns out it's a pretty practical thing to do, that we need to constantly find ways of working together to build coalitions, and a lack of civility truly hampers or precludes that. And one of the groups I point to in making these obligations happen is the clergy. Americans are still a church-going people, whether it's church or synagogue or mosques. We often think of the clergy, the famous line is that they are there to comfort the afflicted. Well, the other half of it, they're there to afflict the comfortable. And they have a response. They've got to call out incivility. They have got to say, no political dispute warrants turning to violence on its behalf. They've got to say, compromise, being open to compromise is the right thing. They've got to say, we talk all the time in church about being one's brother's or sister's keeper. That can't just stay in the church or the synagogue or whatever. That's got to come into the cities, into the towns. We've got to practice that, not just on Sunday mornings, but the other days of the week. So I actually think that, one of the arguments I make in this book is if we're going to make it as a democracy, we can't depend upon some great leader to come along and save us. Voters have to do things, clergy have to do things. There's a role for business leaders, there's a role for educators and so forth, for journalists. This is a distributed set of responsibilities to save this democracy of ours.
You mentioned briefly with the religious leaders denouncing political violence. That's another obligation that I think most people would think, oh, well, of course, Dr. Haass, yes, we're going to renounce violence, but maybe it's also being open enough and honest enough to assess it correctly and honestly. You mentioned the January 6th storming of the Capitol. Not all of them were violent, but obviously large numbers of them were. It's the greatest threat to the American Capitol since the War of 1812. And you note that in the first few hours and days, of the assault on the Capitol, a large number of Republican leaders came out, were horrified by it. They said, this cannot happen. This is not America. This is, just a complete disgrace. But that sadly, we go back to the idea of primaries, that certain numbers of them in the weeks and months and a year afterwards, their tone had changed. It wasn't that bad, or it was an unusual form of protest. But again, maybe is it going back to this fear of their base? And do we need to legitimately say, no, this is political violence and this is a threat to our democracy?
Well, we obviously need to say that. Democracy cannot survive amidst political violence. I spent 3 years as the U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland. And just this week, we're marking the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which brought a degree of peace to Northern Ireland after 3 decades of quasi-civil war there, where thousands lost their lives. That can happen here. We shouldn't kid ourselves. We could have violence between militias. We could have violence where people are doing legitimate protest and they get interfered with. We could have assassination of public figures or judges. We can have stormings of capitals, be it at the state level or city halls or whatever. We shouldn't kid ourselves that it can happen here. And obviously the means are, shall we say, rather well distributed in this society. So we should take it seriously. And I would say with the clergy, it's not enough to react to it. They ought to try to prevent it. And they ought to say, like, the issues they feel most strongly about, say one's has a pure position on right to life, that there ought to be no abortion under any circumstances. My view is simply they ought to couple that with saying, I know many of you feel as strongly as I do, but that does not give anybody a license to use force. That this society depends upon that kind of restraint. There's no ends to justify the means of using force. So again, clergy have to speak out about it, hopefully parents model it, and then voters have to insist on it. So when the reason, at the risk of sounding cynical, in my experience, because you're all sitting down, politicians may not be responsible, indeed often are not, as you were alluding to, but they're always responsive. They can tell which way the political winds are blowing. And not very many go against those political winds, particularly if it risks their position. And God bless those who do, who are standing up. I dedicated the book, in part, to those who are willing to do that. They're rare, but I think, again, the average politician is going to look out for his or her self-interest. It's up to us as citizens, as voters, to encourage them to, shall we say, to do the right thing.
And just maybe to bring it kind of a full circle to kind of foreign policy, what most of our audience knows you the best in regards. And if any of you have questions, my colleagues have those question cards they can pass out. We'll get to those in about 2 questions. Your last and probably most important obligation is put country first. I think an example of it, any of you came last year when we hosted former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper. The title of his book is Sacred Oath. His time in the military and his time in the Defense Department, my oath is to the Constitution. My oath is to the American people. It is not to a party. It is not to a president. Can you talk about the importance of that, and in terms of transitioning it to foreign policy, why it was so concerning the first impeachment trial of Trump, that even if it was unintentional, that military aid to a country already at war with Russia, it hadn't escalated to the level of last year, was being conditioned upon possible support for a political objective?
Well, again, every person, whether he's a president, someone in uniform, a senator, a congressman, quote unquote, an ordinary citizen, we all have our political views. We all have our political preferences. That's normal. It's healthy in a democracy. What makes a democracy special is you have the right not just to hold those views, but to express them and act on them. That's what makes a democracy so worth saving. But the whole idea in our democracy, though, is that we have obligations that, in many ways, no pun intended, trump those rights to express and act on those views. What I thought was truly admirable were the individuals who had the job of Secretary of State in several of the states, in Arizona and elsewhere. These are the jobs of essentially counting, making sure the elections are free and fair, and then making sure the votes are counted in an accurate way. And that several of them certified the results, even though they went against their political preferences. That, to me, is what we want and need in this country. Talk about putting country first. That's the way you do it, or officers, again, of the law. They may be sympathetic to protesters in certain cases, or unsympathetic. Doesn't mean they have to be treated the same way. Again, we put that first. Liz Cheney's an old colleague of mine. We agreed on some things, we disagreed on others, but I've got nothing but admiration for her willingness to put her principles before her own career. That, to me, was a truly, that's admirable. That is, and again, if you go back to profiles in courage, often people who do the right thing do pay a price. And it's kind of easy for the rest of us to say, well, history will show that okay, but history, that might not be around soon enough to help you. So you've got to take your hats off. But we want a society where that's not so exceptional, but it becomes the norm. And again, I think it becomes less exceptional if people are rewarded for doing it or penalized for not doing it. One of the things I've concluded is we get the government we deserve, just not necessarily the one we need. So I really think in many ways, kind of up to us in incentivizing certain behaviors and penalizing others. It's actually really sad. Can I say this? Actually, I thought it was kind of sad that I needed to write this book. I felt compelled to write it. And then it was really sad that the 10th and final obligation was to put country first. The idea that that has to be explicitly articulated, I mean, really? But alas, it does. And, so we are where we are. We can't deny it. And I happen to think that this democracy is, shall we say, it's priceless. It is the greatest experiment politically in modern or in any history, and it's worth preserving. But it's going to take some collective and individual effort to do just that.
And like saying, to transition to the two biggest topics in foreign policy for now, and probably for sadly for the Ukrainians for years to come, and maybe the Taiwanese as well. How do you assess this year plus, or really, I suppose, 2-3 years really, approach of the Biden administration to Ukraine, especially once the full-scale war broke out? And maybe more importantly, some of you may have read Richard's article in Foreign Affairs that you told me you got commentary from all different corners of the world. I don't know if you can share who those people were.
Probably not.
But if you could talk about kind of what were some of the scenarios and kind of outlooks you see for the war that some sides may or may not want to actually think about or consider?
Okay, so I'll try to compress it as best I can, but it's going to take 2 or 3 minutes, so bear with me. If we had this meeting 15 months ago, and we had said it looks like Russia's going to invade Ukraine for the second time. They invaded in 2014. They did it, as it turned out, in February of last year. And you had said 15 months later, Ukraine would still control roughly 85% of its territory, and Russian inroads would be minimal. We would have said, really? That's fantastic. And I think in some ways that's where we are. It's been really impressive. The Ukrainian willingness and ability to fight, to come together, has been nothing short of awe-inspiring. And I think the United States deserves considerable credit for revitalizing the NATO alliance and other partners in Europe and around the world, and coming to what I call the indirect defense of Ukraine. We don't have American troops there, but what we have been providing is equipment, ammunition, intelligence, training, what have you. And it's worked pretty well. Problem is, we are where we are after roughly 15 months. Ukraine is getting decimated. This was a country before the war of just over 40 million people. Probably close to 20% are either refugees or internally displaced. Large loss of life. The economy is down by maybe a third. And I'm worried that a few more years of war, I don't want to see Ukraine destroyed in order to save it. On the other hand, I'm wary of any compromise because we're fighting not just for Ukraine, but for the principle that aggression cannot pay. We do not want to set the precedent either for Mr. Putin or anybody else that you can invade countries and get away with it, or the world will become a jungle. So the question is, how do we square these various concerns? I'm also worried about some other things. I'm worried about the shortage of ammunition and equipment in the United States because we've been giving so much to Ukraine. We no longer have the industrial capability to produce enough of it fast enough. I'm worried about the fact that we're now shorthanded should there be crises in other parts of the world. I know we're going to talk about Taiwan in a second, or against Iran. I'm also worried about the uncertain political support in this country and in parts of Europe for Ukraine. So what I'm trying to do is think of a way of how we protect the principle that no aggressor ought to be rewarded. On the other hand, how do we save Ukraine? And how do we ensure that we ourselves are in a position to deal with multiple crises, not just this one in Europe? So what I've put forward with one of my colleagues in Foreign Affairs, which I would hope it's a magazine that many of you read. We are the publisher of it, I should admit it, at the Council on Foreign Relations, but it is the leading journal in the world about the world. It was before I got there, and it will be after I leave this position. And I basically argue for continuing to help Ukraine but also to introduce a diplomatic dimension to this, a negotiating dimension. I'm not sure it'll work. Quite possible the Russians will reject it, but then if they reject it, then that says something. And I think that would make it less difficult to continue to provide Ukraine with the help it needs. If they accept it, it would mean Ukraine would have to agree temporarily to accept the reality of Russian occupation, but it would not give up in any way its long-term goals of complete liberation of its territory. It just wouldn't go about it using military force, which I think is of uncertain prospects. It's like any compromise, what I've proposed is not enough for some and too much for others. My concern is the most likely scenario is this war continues. That if we had this meeting a year from now, it would still be going on. And I just worry about the long-term direct and indirect costs of continued conflict. So we'll see. But my view was at least to try to introduce an argument for trying to change the dynamics here. We'll see if it works.
And just to transition to obviously by far the biggest player in the world, in a lot of ways becoming an equal to the United States in a lot of ways in terms of economic capacity. It's depending on how you measure it. PPP, maybe comparable size economies, a very large and capable military. You mentioned throughout the book that at the end of the day, if we are dysfunctional as a country, we cannot hope for other developing countries or even advanced countries to look to the United States for a model of democracy. Putin loves it. President Xi in China loves it. So, the January 6th, that was all over their news. Look at the disaster in the United States. Look what democracy does. You can't do anything. It's lawlessness. It's chaos. We have long-term competition with China. Hopefully we keep it within safe and peaceful bounds. But a lot of people will say, whether you agree or disagree with Trump, he was maybe the first to correctly call out that we are at a new level of, we should be honest with ourselves that China is an absolute competitor, in some ways maybe an adversary. Someone asked here, and it really applies to various administrations across the years, Democrat and Republican, you worked in. Someone says, Secretary Pompeo in his book, we hosted Secretary Pompeo in January, made a reference, and I paraphrase, that you and several other people in the administration were weak on China. If I got this quote right, how do you counter this?
Well, since I wasn't in the Trump administration, it's hard for me to see how the quote is correct.
No, I think they mean previous administrations. Oh. Okay, sorry.
Well, I think it's true. The previous administrations made a bet on China. And it goes back about 20, 25 years. Just to remind you, the modern relationship with China had its roots about 40 years ago, in the early 70s, under Nixon and Kissinger. And the glue that brought us together somewhat was a shared opposition to the Soviet Union and Soviet power. And that lasted for 2 decades until the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union. So the United States and China needed to find a new rationale for doing business together, and it was doing business. And we basically, we were very interested in their market, the most populous country in the world, and they were very interested in economic development, and we were a source of all sorts of technology, so it looked like a good match. Our agenda, though, wasn't simply that China, though, would develop. Our agenda was that China would develop and evolve, and we were hoping it would become more open at home, less repressive, more market-oriented, and would pursue or continue to pursue a foreign policy that was responsible, did not destabilize the region or the world. What happened over these 20 years is those hopes were not borne out. China became more repressive, much less market-oriented economically, and much more muscular, shall we say, in its foreign policy. And this has really happened over the last 10 years under the current leadership, under Xi Jinping. And the Trump administration, I agree, deserves credit for calling that out. Indeed, there is virtually no difference whatsoever between the Trump foreign policy towards China and the Biden foreign policy towards China. They're essentially the same policy. Some of the details, if anything, if there's a difference, the Biden administration is even tougher in some areas. I think it represents something of a new consensus. There's almost a little bit of competition between the parties. That said, we've got to take a step back and take a deep breath and ask ourselves, what should be our goals with China? Is it to turn China, as Secretary Pompeo often does, turn it away from communism, to get rid of the Communist Party? Ain't going to happen. That is not a serious, feasible foreign policy goal. What our foreign policy ought to be is to shape Chinese choices in its foreign policy. That is the traditional stuff of foreign policy. It's very much in the spirit of 41's foreign policy towards China and towards we can't transform it, but we can shape its foreign policy calculations. And what we want China to do, however reluctant, we can't change their aspirations. They're going to want what they want. We can't change their nature, but we can change their behavior. So we ought to focus on that. We ought to decide what behaviors we want to focus on the most. I would say paramount is Taiwan. Much longer conversation, but we never want any Chinese leader to conclude that he can use force against Taiwan and the benefits of so doing will outweigh the costs. We have got to persuade China that by whatever it would do, militarily, diplomatically, economically, the price they would pay for moving in any way, in any form against Taiwan, the price would be far greater than any perceived benefits. Because we know that China wants to absorb Taiwan. What we have to do is discourage them from taking actions in that direction. I think that is a possible, realistic foreign policy goal. We'll have to do lots of things in order to position ourselves to do it. And I think now we ought to be talking with China about Taiwan, about setting up some rules of the road so accidents and so forth don't trigger a conflict. We ought to look for areas where we might be able to cooperate. China came out with a peace proposal on Ukraine a few months ago. Okay, let's take them up on it. Let's talk to them. Let's see whether they've got the closest relationship in the world with Russia. You're not going to get an agreement to slow down this war without Russia signing on to it. Who is better positioned than China to do that? Nobody. Okay, I'd talk to them about that. 90% of North Korea's goods go in and out of China. North Korea now is the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world, probably other than China. Okay, so let's talk to China about North Korea. Let's go around. And basically, I have no illusions, but my feeling is this is a major country, as you said. It's the world's second largest economy. This century is very much going to be defined by the relationship between the United States and China. So what we ought to try to do is put ourselves in a position that we can persuade China to make better or less bad decisions when it comes to its foreign policy. Part of it then is all the things I've just talked about. Part of it's also what we've been talking about earlier. the strength of American democracy, to build a consensus here, to build an example. I would love for more people around the world to get up in the morning and say, I much prefer the American system. I like democracy. I like capitalism. I like what these Americans are doing. I don't want to get in bed with the Chinese. I don't like what it is they're offering. I would like people in China to see that. So again, what we do at home, the example we set is powerful, but the foreign policies we carry out, the defense policies we carry out, again, my goal is not to transform China, it's to shape its behavior in ways that bring about greater restraint.
Okay, and just for the sake of time, let's maybe combine we'll just kind of 2 more questions, and then Richard will kindly sign books at the back of the room. If you guys will bear with me, I might bring him to the back of the room so he can start signing books before, so you guys can, everyone I know will want to talk to him afterwards, but if you'll let us kind of walk back there. Two questions I'll kind of combine. You mentioned religious leaders. We've mentioned education and teachers. 2 interesting questions here. I'll combine them. Galen asks, what role do elites, including in this room, have to play in demanding more and greater integrity from leaders in public and private life? And another related question similar to that from Laura asks, what's the role for business leaders in supporting and promoting our democracy, and how can we make an impact?
As the cliche goes, I'm glad you asked those questions. Look, business leaders, a couple of things. One is to make it easy for their employees to vote. Hundreds of firms are doing that. Give people 3 or 4 hours off so they can go vote or work at a poll, or give them the day off. I think it's personally a little bit crazy that voting day is on a Tuesday when people have to work and go to school and other stuff. I personally would like to make it either make it a national holiday so people didn't work, or have it on a weekend, but so be it. Government probably won't do that. So business leaders can do it. They can create a political environment where they're not telling people how to vote, they're just making it easier to vote. I think that's a pretty good thing. I also think, though, business leaders, lots of other things. I'll mention 2. Again, I'll lose the half of the audience I may have already lost. One is, I don't think business leaders should be sending political contributions to any candidate who is anti-democracy. I do not believe business leaders ought to be supporting people who are election deniers. Sorry, do not believe they ought to be. Don't believe businesses ought to be advertising their products or services on outlets that are undermining American democracy. I'm not asking anyone to take a stance on this or that policy, but I am asking them to take a stance on democracy. And we're pressuring business leaders to take stances on the environment or on inclusiveness issues, diversity issues. Why not pressure business leaders to take a stance on democracy? I don't see why that's off limits. So I would do that. What can elites do? Everything we've talked about. So elites can influence businesses from inside or from the outside. Elites can contribute to candidates or can become candidates. Elites can go to school board meetings. There's been a lot of stuff written about so-called critical race theory and so forth. Well, people can go to schools, public schools, private schools, religious schools, charter schools at the high school level, universities and colleges, and raise the question, why aren't we teaching civics? Why is that not part of the necessary preparation of young men and women in this country? That when they get this diploma, that they have at least had a fundamental grounding in American democracy and citizenship. Why is that any less important than one additional course in something else? We don't want them leaving a campus or a school unable to read, think critically, work in teams, have access to computers, whatever. Why is this any less? Why isn't this right up there with that? I would say it is no less important. And I think, again, there's what parents do. Ronald Reagan, one of my favorite quotes of his is he said, the most important room in America is the dining room, and it's the conversations around the table. And I actually think, teachers teach in classrooms, but parents teach in the home. So I think there's a role. You don't have to be elite to do that. It's just something we all can and should do.
And just a quick follow-up is a great student question for what we're talking about companies, and then I would just combine two questions for kind of to conclude everything. Daria from the Audi International School, great to have all of you here tonight. Daria asks, do you think specifically tech companies have an obligation to prevent echo chambers, especially in terms of the dominance of social media now?
It's a big question, and it's one I've wrestled with. In about 2 months, the Supreme Court is going to issue a really important opinion about tech companies. They had 2 days of oral arguments recently dealing with the 1996 law that essentially says companies like any of them that provide the pipes for social media are not responsible for the content. And that's essentially, and the question is, ought they to become slightly more or much more responsible for what they carry? My guess is the court will not rule on it. We'll say that's up to Congress because Congress passed the law originally, and Congress won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So I don't have a lot of confidence that tech companies will police their cyberspace. It's also very difficult to do given the sheer volume and speed with which things are posted. It's also, at times, you may not want it done, because you might say, hey, that's my free speech right you're interfering with. So it turns out to be one of the most complicated issues I know, and probably the new technologies are going to make it even more complicated. AI, ChatGPT, and so forth. So I keep coming back to educated consumers. That rather than asking the tech companies to police, we have to in some ways become more critical consumers and try to influence others so they can become more critical. I think that's a more realistic path. I don't like my answer. It is not a solution by any means, but I'm just skeptical that we will be able to, quote unquote, solve this by getting the tech companies to act fundamentally differently.
And just last two questions to kind of close it out. Alex, related to teaching and civics in particular, Alex asked, how will current and looming teacher shortages, specifically high-quality teacher shortages with experience in subject areas, threaten our democracy, and how does our society combat that? And then on a broader scale for just the general public, Beth asks, how do you believe the ideas presented in the Bill of Obligations can be implemented in practical terms at the individual and policy level?
Well, the question of the shortage of high-quality teachers is right. We see it. All sorts of reasons why, from the nature of teacher education to compensation issues. I also think at higher education, the whole tenure system often skews incentives. I'll put that gently. Not a big fan of it myself. I don't know a simple answer to it. We want to, public service. One of the things I call for in the book is much greater emphasis on public service, incentivizing it. Teaching can be a form of it. Groups like Teach for America get more talented people there. Teacher training, we do a lot of education. We produce probably more educational resources about the world. We at the Council on Foreign Relations than any other institution. One of the things we've learned is you've got to put a lot of calories into teacher training. It's not even close to being good enough to produce good material. What you've got to do is help people understand how they can use that good material in classrooms with modern learning systems, and the rest of you, it's almost, you've got to go down market. I don't mean in the sense of lower, but I mean in terms of really thinking much harder about the execution, the delivery and execution of our resources. There's got to be more resources for teacher training throughout careers. We tend to think of education and training. It's almost like, it's what I call the gas station metaphor. It's like you fill up the tank and you think you then drive down the highway for 40 or 50 years. We need to have much more of a top-it-off approach, where teacher training is something that happens regularly. But again, parents, and that's one of the reasons I'm in favor of charter schools. I want there to be more pressure, more choice. I live in New York City. We're spending more and more per pupil, and we have fewer and fewer pupils. People are voting with their feet. And there's problems with teacher unions. There are lots of problems in the city. So I actually think our educational system, think about it. People line up around the world at U.S. consulates to go to American colleges and universities. I haven't noticed a lot of people lining up at U.S. consulates around the world to go to U.S. elementary schools and public schools. Why is that? One reason may be we have incomparably more competition in higher education in this country. We are the envy of the world than we have at lower levels of education. So I actually think far more competition in elementary schools and high schools would be a really healthy thing in this country. Last question is kind of the omnibus question, which is how do we, look, that's the reason I'm doing this. I could be at home sulking over the fact that the Knicks lost last night, but I'm not. I'm here. And I want to have a national conversation about these issues. I'm surprised that I feel this way, but I'm no longer sanguine. And as I said before, we're going to mark the 250th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, of the Declaration of Independence, rather, in 3 years. Well, we've got a massive political challenge between now and then called the 2024 election. We've got a big challenge in 2 months called the debt ceiling. We're going to have some Supreme Court decisions that are going to shake this society to its core. So I just don't take things for granted. So what we need is a conversation when people go home, and hopefully some of you will read the book. Hopefully you'll encourage some of your friends to read it. Talk about it in school. Talk about it in church. Talk about it across the dinner table, and so at work. And that's what I want. I want this to be something of a conversation. And again, I'm not advocating for policy. We haven't talked about policy tonight. What I'm advocating for is how we go about political life in America. And it's worth saving, but it's also it's on the endangered list. We shouldn't kid ourselves. It's just because something's lasted 2.5 centuries, there's nothing about the history of democracy that makes it permanent. Ukraine is the exception. Ukraine is an example of a democracy that is threatened by invasion. History suggests the greatest threat to democracy is not invasion, it's internal decay. Democracies decline from within. That is the threat here in the United States. The good news, nothing's inevitable. We can sort it out, we can get it right. The bad news, nothing's inevitable. It's not automatically going to turn out right. That's why it's up to us.
We have Richard's excellent and very timely and illuminating book, and hopefully inspiring book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits for Good Citizens, at the back of the room, and he will kindly be signing them. And on behalf of the whole council and everyone here, will you all please join me in welcoming, or thanking Richard Haass for your many years of service to our nation. Thank you.